a circular economy is a shift from that. It's a more sustainable way of not just consuming products, but also living, what we do with our spaces, how we protect our spaces, our natural resources, what kind of materials we make as well. So it stretches across a lot of different areas. And one of the key principles about circular economy is regenerative design. And how can we regenerate natural spaces, right? So stuff like net positive is right aligned with the circular economy. And then I started thinking about that in that, natural spaces, what is a natural space? And I started thinking about terrestrial ecology, and that's why we have you here, man. Thanks for joining us.
No,
Dr. Sean.
my pleasure.
So I'll do a brief introduction here. So you're a terrestrial ecologist. You've worked over a decade in the UK and in the Middle East, and you are specializing in biodiversity, and you're a senior consultant specializing in biodiversity and impacts on planning, right? So welcome, man. Thanks for joining me. It's great to be here. So
thank you for having me, Sad.
Can you tell me a little bit about, define what is, for those of us that don't know, right? Or maybe we understand, we watch we watch channels once in a while and you see animals and you say, okay, that's biodiversity. But tell me a little bit about what is terrestrial ecology?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the introduction, Sad. Thanks for inviting me today. But yeah, I think generally speaking, I think the terrestrial part of terrestrial ecology is quite self-explanatory. So obviously it's land-based, but the ecology part, very generally speaking, it's considered kind of the relationship between living things and the environment. It's typically used when describing wildlife, but it covers everything from wildlife to plants to abiotic factors like climate, geology, soil, etc., etc. So that's kind of overarching. It's a kind of broad term, ecology, and it doesn't belie the complexity of it, because it describes how everything relates to everything in the world, which is a hugely complex topic. But within that, one of the core themes is biodiversity or biological diversity, which is the variation of all living things. Mm-hmm. Typically, like you alluded to, that tends to be related to things like species. Now you define different species, but it can be used for genetics. It's also used for ecosystems as well. But yeah, a core part of terrestrial ecology is biodiversity. Yeah.
Right. So one of your focuses is planning and the impacts on biodiversity and vice versa. So tell me a little bit about why is it important for cities for urban environments to care about terrestrial ecology in particular?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, isn't it? A lot of people, we've heard biodiversity and we've heard ecology, but I think one of the questions I get asked quite a lot is, what's the value of it? Why should we care? Why do we care if a panda goes extinct? Why do we care if there's not as many fish as there was before? And I think in a kind of broad sense, I think biodiversity gives two kind of general benefits. One of them being a kind of instrumental value. So that's like the benefits it brings to people. That's like ecosystem services, so like flood defence and clean air, but also things like natural resources, so fish stocks. You've also got things like medicine. So I think I was reading recently that somewhere between sort of 25 and 50% of all over-the-counter drugs are plant-derived. Right. So our medicine industry relies on biodiversity for a treatment of symptoms, for instance. But you've also got recreational value, so that's things like zoos or national parks, and then you've also got some cultural and heritage value as well. So areas that humans have decided are important, areas of nature. So that's they're the kind of like tangible ones, and I think a lot of the time when it comes to planning and policy, those are the ones that we focus on, because it's easy for funders and lenders to grab onto that and say, okay, this is tangible, it's quantifiable, we can track the progress, we know it has a monetary value. As an ecologist, I think something that doesn't get talked about enough is the kind of intrinsic value of species. So they have a value in their own, they have desires, they have wants, they have needs, and they also have a history. They have a long-standing history, they have a legacy, they have evolution. And those things, for me, they are equally as valuable, just because we don't necessarily see the direct benefit from it.
Right.
For me, their existence has value.
Right.
Yeah. And the last part to it is we have tried to identify all of these factors for value, but I think there needs to be the caveat that there's also unknown. So if we end up losing all of this biodiversity, not only do we lose these instrumental and intrinsic values, but there's a gap there that the things that we don't know we'll lose also. So in terms of the value of it, that's how I generally sum up the value of biodiversity. And then in regards to cities, it's important that we protect that so that we get those benefits.
Right. You mentioned indirect benefits, right? So obviously there's the intrinsic value that it's about protecting life, preserving life, respecting sentient beings. But you also mentioned indirect, obviously the direct benefits, like, you going to a zoo, for example, is a very direct thing, or being exposed to green spaces, with flora and fauna, and you see birds, and there's a lot of studies that it's really good psychologically for you.
Yeah.
And it's something that people can directly experience. But if a city doesn't protect biodiversity, or if an urban environment doesn't respect its biodiversity, what do you think are some of the indirect benefits that you essentially lose out on?
I guess in sense there's kind of regulatory services. I think particularly in a city context, some of the main services that biodiversity can provide is things like improved air quality,
Right.
flood defence,
Right.
These kind of things. So if we have an urban area, then we're having to design some of these natural barriers that exist or that are naturally occurring.
Right.
So if we don't have any areas for biodiversity, then we're at more risk from things like changes in environment, flooding, erosion. Particularly here in the Middle East, for instance, where we have a lot of we have pretty poor quality air. Dust is a major issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the solutions to that, one of the kind of nature-based solutions to that, is to revegetate or to plant, to create a natural barrier for dust. But also, our plants will absorb some of the pollutants too. So
Right.
essentially, whilst we're not getting that direct benefit, the longer term is that it's improvement in our health.
Yeah.
And you also alluded to the fact that there's also a mental health aspect to that too.
Right. Yeah.
Which is something that shouldn't be underestimated. I was reading an article from the NHS in the UK yesterday, and they were just talking about the fact that they've done a kind of a long-term study to look at the benefits of just having green spaces in terms of patient recovery, and it's and they were just saying that just having access, just seeing a green space speeds up patient recovery, both short-term and long-term.
Right.
Yeah. So there are tangible benefits there, but that's more of a direct one.
Yeah.
But
Just one of the indirect ones, well, we're saying indirect, but I guess it's something that people might overlook. You mentioned flood protection.
Yeah.
And mangroves, man, because, the work that when you're planning stuff, especially coastal developments,
Yeah.
just the value of mangroves is so underestimated. Because when you look at because if you're someone that doesn't know the value of a mangrove, then you wouldn't realize how much it's doing for that area in terms of flood protection, carbon sequestration, creating that habitat for so many different species. It's a nursing grounds for fish, and it's pretty spectacular.
It is,
Yeah.
and I think it's one of those situations where we've maybe been a little bit naive in thinking that we are going to be able to design. I mean, we have things in place that can do that. We have flood defences, right? But I mean, my understanding is that these mangroves have developed in their specific environment over a huge period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So they are specifically adapted to provide these functions, if you like.
Yeah.
And I think that somewhere along the way, we thought, hey, it's okay. We can do something in 3 hours that's taken nature thousands of years. But I can see that that's changing. I can see that actually what we're now looking towards is those types of solutions. And the mangrove one's a really good one. So they have started, I've seen a project in Singapore recently where they were looking at using, I think what they call it is soft protection.
Okay.
So I've heard this term recently, soft protection and hard protection. So hard protection is like your rocks, your building materials, your
Engineering
man-made structures.
solutions, essentially.
Engineering solutions.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but your soft is your nature-based solutions.
Okay.
So instead of building a rivetman or a barrier, a concrete barrier, you plant mangroves, and then it does exactly the same thing, and if not better, and you hit a series of other benefits. So it's not just about flood defence; it's also about carbon as well. And then you've also got habitat for biodiversity. So you can see that. I mean, the mangrove one's a really good example. It's very tangible, and it's been implemented.
Yeah. You mentioned nature-based solutions. I was reading a little bit about it, and over 30% of the solutions for the climate change scenario are potentially nature-based. I think the stat is like between 37% of the answer to the problem. And we have the COP happening right now. 37% is nature-based. And I mean, that's a serious statistic, right?
Yeah.
And that really deserves some thinking into, like, how can we plan our cities? So just on that, have you come across, are there any examples that you could share of cities that have done, or urban environments really, that have done really well in that integration of terrestrial ecology and protecting the wider biodiversity?
Yeah, I think most countries, or certainly most countries in the world, have some sort of biodiversity policy or plans in place.
Okay.
And a lot of that relies on or focuses on cities, because obviously that's where most people live, and increasingly so as we move forward. In terms of the kind of things that you can do in cities, I mean, there's a whole suite of things that you can do. But I think some of the things that have been successful is increasing things like green spaces. So that's a model that works, and it's a model that's been rolled out across, I'd say, a huge amount of countries in the world, and you'll experience it here. And most of the cities you go to have these green spaces. And that's a good starting point, but I think what we then need to be looking at is not just having these green spaces, but also having these kind of nature spaces, these kind of wilder spaces. Because I think a lot of the parks that we have are kind of monoculture grass parks. They don't have those wild spaces for biodiversity to exist. So we need to have those green spaces. These green spaces are almost therapeutic in nature, actually. So I think we can reframe it a little bit and say, okay, these green spaces are for our health. But we need to make space for nature, having some of these wilder areas. So nature parks, nature reserves within cities. I've seen more of them over the last 10 years.
Right.
And that's also good. But I think one of the other issues generally for biodiversity is that it's not connected. It's becoming increasingly fragmented.
Right.
So within a city, we'll have these green parks all over the city, and we have them in Dubai, we have them in my hometown Glasgow, for instance. But what I am seeing is that governments are moving more towards a connected approach to it. So you may have these parks that are spread out across the city, but then what you want to be doing is creating these kind of corridors that are connecting these parks. So the species may not be living in these corridors, but what they will be doing is having access to these other populations. Right. Which then creates a more kind of robust and resilient community of species.
Right. So essentially you're saying that a group of animals can kind of move between territories, because depending on the species, what's the benefit? I guess the question here is, if you go to the extent of connecting these different parks, right, and or you mentioned wilder areas, what is the benefit to the natural biodiversity? I mean, I understand that they can move between spaces, species of different animals, but what's the benefit to them versus being localized?
I mean, it essentially comes down to genetics. If you have a fragmented, disparate population, then essentially you only have a restricted gene pool. So essentially what happens in those situations is that there'll be more and more and more inbreeding, which means that the health of the population diminishes, with the potential of then essentially having local extinctions if they are small enough, and if they are separate for long enough. So in terms of the benefit, it means that you have a healthier gene pool. And then it means that the species survives.
So if I'm hearing you right, you're saying the fragmentation makes the population more vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Essentially,
Yeah.
less resilient to changes, less resilient to climate change, pollution, etc.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they're just in that one space. And if something happens to that one space, then it's gone.
Yeah.
And we've seen that. So what are you mentioned the integration of green spaces, of wilder areas. What are some of the challenges in actually implementing that? Because, there's urban plans, especially in the region that we're in right now. There's a lot of development here. We've got a lot of land in this region.
Yeah.
And there's going to be new cities happening all over. So what are some of the challenges in implementing these concepts?
I think the challenges are probably well known. I mean, we have a lot of conflict of interest.
Okay.
One of the biggest threats to biodiversity, as you just alluded to, is habitat destruction. And what you tend to find is you have that conflict between socio-economic development and protection of species. And I think that we now have solutions in place in terms of land use that we discussed, also in terms of landscaping practices. So we can build in planting regimes and using specific species of plants for landscaping at a city level. But I think one of the big challenges will be changing attitudes towards biodiversity. Mm-hmm. I think not only within the people, but also within organisations, within developers, within governments as well. We need to see a movement towards a more integrated approach across the board, from the community level all the way through to policy. And I think that is a fundamental challenge, because essentially I think whilst we've talked a lot about biodiversity in terms of nature, I think these are human problems. And I think that if you don't have the right people on board making the right decisions and building in plans, then biodiversity isn't protected. So essentially, as we are aware, it is the people that are the problem, which is also an opportunity, because we can have conversations like this and we can increase awareness and we can be more connected to it. But I think, a side note, if we do increase biodiversity in cities, one of the things that I have seen occurring is this. There's a couple of things here. So what species of biodiversity do we want in cities? Because I'm pretty sure that there'll be quite a lot of people that have some sort of kind of phobia with certain species of animals. I don't think we're going to want tigers and leopards and wolves.
I don't know if you've seen the videos online of snakes in supermarkets in Australia. It's like this big.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So that poses some challenges as well. There will be an increase in human-wildlife conflict. There is increasingly so, because we are encroaching, as our cities grow, we're encroaching into natural habitats.
Right.
So there is a need to be thinking about ways in which we can protect those. But also, we need to be thinking about how we can enhance the things we already have and potentially restore some of the things we already have too. I'm kind of curious about, you were talking about that kind of non-linear approach to using materials and sourcing materials, and I think it's a really interesting one, but it does pose some challenges. We have to kind of reframe how we think about our materials and where we get them from and what we use it for. And I think, yeah,
materials and even spaces, right? Yeah. So it's also about, I think, definitely with the circular economy, materials is a big part of that. But it's not just materials; it's a whole system. It's a systematic shift to how we essentially consume. How we're, when you're planning place, it can either be a single function or it could be multifunctional, right? So if a single functional space, it just does one thing, right? So and it does this one thing between for 5 hours a day. What's it doing for the rest of the time? It's dead space there, right? So it's having that multifunctional aspect and more integrated approach to urban environments, and even beyond urban environments, really. It applies everywhere, how resourceful can we be. So, for example, regenerative agriculture, right? Yeah. Regenerative agriculture is something very promising. It's being done right now. There's organizations doing it at scale in Africa, where they've had some really successful projects. There's this one organization called Just Dig It.
Yeah.
I think they're Europe-based organization. They're doing a lot of work in Africa, and they essentially they're growing trees. And I mean, you look at the stump, if you're walking across, and you see like a stump of a tree, you're thinking, oh, that tree's dead. But actually it's not, right? So you've got the stump, you've got the roots, and if you give it the right conditions, the tree will regrow.
Yeah.
And so that work is happening, and it all falls within that whole systemic approach, which is circular economy, where regenerative design, regenerating spaces is such an important part of that puzzle. One of the things, like when you mentioned policy and implementation just now, right? About, from community level all the way up to like decision makers. And, we're all seeing the 1.5 degrees message everywhere, right? And there's some doomsday messages as well, like the ship has sailed, it's too late now. I'm curious about how does this, what we've talked about right now, biodiversity, terrestrial ecology, how does that interplay with the climate change narrative? Because obviously it does, but really curious to hear from you where you see the linkages and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thought about it a little bit actually, obviously, before we had this meeting today.
Yeah.
And I think what it comes down to is providing that kind of resilience to change, and I think by resilience I mean kind of an adaptability. So let's say, for instance, you have an ecosystem that has maybe one or two species in it. I mean, that's unlikely, but let's assume that that's the case. We have an ecosystem with very few species. So these species will fulfill a specific ecological niche, and they will have limitations on their existence. So maybe that's water dependency or temperature or whatever it may be. Now, if we change the environment around it, that species no longer fits within that environment. So what you may end up happening is the species may go locally extinct, or they may have to move somewhere else. Now, if you don't have enough biodiversity in that area, and there are changes in that environment, then we have ecosystem collapse. So what we end up with is a less resilient ecosystem, which is more susceptible to things like climatic change. So with an increase in biodiversity, we have almost like a safeguarding of our ecosystems, and then all of the services that they provide, all of the value that brings us, both as a society and beyond. So
I want to ask you about ecosystem collapse, because one of the things that has hit me in the past couple of weeks is there's a real visceral and real impact of climate change, right? And ecosystems collapsing is a very real threat. But unless you really get into what does that mean for us, you don't care about it, because it's about, why should I care about ecosystem collapse? What happens if an ecosystem collapses? What's the impact on us?
Well, it depends. I guess it depends on the ecosystem. Well, it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of the value of it. So I think it's really complicated. I'm not quite sure necessarily what the definition is for an ecosystem collapsing, but certainly what you do see in highly disturbed ecosystems like urban systems is you end up with a limited number of species. You end up with mostly generalists. You lose your specialist species, so you end up with, I would assume, you end up with a loss of a significant number of the services that the ecosystems provide. So we'll have less flood defence, we'll have poorer air quality, there will be less wind erosion. So essentially what we're ending up with is a situation where we're going to have to solve the problems ourselves. And do we have the technology for that? Do we have the capabilities? I mean, I would say that we probably do have a lot of the technology in place, but on the scale that's required and the time that we have, it becomes much more challenging than protecting the systems that we already have. And as an alternative, my preference would be obviously to protect what we have.
And I mean, the question is, do we really want to replace life with just tech?
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Well, some people do, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, there's been so many studies that, being around life, being around natural spaces, being around, it's just so beneficial for us as human beings, because that's how we lived for like forever before like the past, couple of 100 years where the Industrial Revolution and everything changed, right? So that's really that's our natural way of being. We're hardwired that way.
Yeah.
Our body clocks work better that way. And yeah, man, it's just fascinating. You mentioned ecosystem services, and this is something that I've been thinking about as well. I mean, it is really important for us to value our ecosystems, right? In like literally, that should be a tool for decision makers.
Yeah.
Right. Is there some, like, have you seen that? Is that developing in the right direction? Are you seeing programs or certifications, et cetera, bodies? Is it being given the right amount of precedence? Because carbon is, right? Carbon, there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of, there's carbon accounting teams being set up in like so many different organizations. But not enough. I'm personally not seeing enough about, biodiversity. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts as well. Do you think we're on the right track, or do you think we're behind? And yes, carbon is important, but we can't lose sight of the natural biodiversity part of the climate change equation.
Yeah, again, I've been thinking about that quite a lot recently. I think that carbon has been the kind of the face of climate change for quite some time now. And I think the systems are established. There's been a lot of work gone into it, and I think we're now starting to understand that actually we need to be looking at biodiversity in a more serious way. There are processes in place. There are ways to quantify it. There are tools to be used, and I think that you do see that there are some really good initiatives that are coming out. There's one called Biophilia in Cities, and that's all about a collective approach to increasing biodiversity in cities. There's also a biodiversity index. I think it's Cities Biodiversity Index. It's been developed by, I think it was Singapore National Parks Board, Nature Parks Board. I forget the name of them. But essentially, that is a way. It's a self-assessment for cities to assess what contributions they're making to biodiversity, kind of what the status is, and what they're doing about it. And within that, you have things like ecosystem services, and you have species lists, and populations, and range, and all this sort of stuff. So there are efforts being made to both quantify it and also initiatives, global initiatives to increase it. But I think that it still feels like it's fairly early on in that process. And I think places like Europe, they have some more established processes potentially. But I think there still needs to be quite a lot of progress globally on that. And right. I do think we're a little bit behind in the carbon sense. But I would like to see that aligned stronger. These kind of conversations we're having now highlight the fact that we need to be thinking more about biodiversity. Yeah.
Especially given that it's such a big piece of this puzzle, right? Like the whole biodiversity part of the story it's not something that's just going to look after itself. Like we'll just focus on the carbon and replace everything with tech. That's not
terrifying thought.
That's a terrifying thought, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there a little bit. I feel like my personal opinion is that we do have a natural affinity with nature. I mean, you've probably heard biophilia before, so you see it in young kids. So when young kids are first born, they have this natural inquisitive mind, and obviously they have a curiosity about nature. And I think that if you don't grow up in an environment where you have access to that, then you lose that connection to it. And I think that's kind of where a lot of people are at the moment. We talked about the fact that our lifestyles have changed in the last few hundred years because of the agricultural revolution, or industrial revolution. And I think we're in a little bit of a scary place in that regard, because a lot of people have lost that connection with it. But what I do see, I take some of my friends out who have grown up in Dubai, and they initially have a little bit of trepidation around the experience if we go into nature somewhere. But I find that after a kind of mindset and after a kind of loosening or letting go of these ideas, then there's a lot of value that's gained from it. And then they come back to me and say, okay, look, I know I was teasing you about going and seeing this hill, but actually that was wonderful.
Yeah.
So I think that although there may be a disconnect, I think that it's very easy to reconnect people with that. And I think that particularly here in this country, I feel like there's a huge opportunity to reconnect people
Awesome. And just in that, opportunity to reconnect, what do you think people can do, like as individuals, to push this conversation up a little bit? What is the little thing that, again, like, I said at the start, we all watch the, Natural Geographic once in a while, and we feel terrible for what's happening. And, you see the images of, ice caps melting and all that, and you feel horrible for 15 minutes, and then you go about your day, right? So what can people do, if they were to do something today, tomorrow, about this that would help in some way?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It can feel like sometimes that you can't have an impact, but you certainly can. And I think, what we're doing just now is engaging with the topic, and I think that's a good starting point for people. I think just trying to understand what it means and the value of biodiversity is a good starting point. So education is a good part, engagement, but I also think that being engaged, being more active in your community when it comes to things like maybe local charities or NGOs or initiatives, and engaging with them, taking your time out to encourage these things. But I also think that in a more direct sense, I think that if we were growing more of our own stuff, if we had more garden spaces, if we were planting on our balconies, it has a dual purpose. It's not just about increasing biodiversity and creating these little spots for nature to exist, but it's also because it brings us closer to it as well. So we will get a direct benefit from that, and as we discussed before, there's a whole myriad of health benefits associated with that too. But I would say just get out and engage with it. Plant in your garden, plant on your balconies, and it will start to snowball. It won't become a thing that's just a 50-minute episode in your life. It will be integrated into your life. It will become part of you.
Right.
And I think for me that is one of the essential things. As individuals, we need to be part of that rather than separate from it.
Yeah. I think it also leads well into the whole topic of, we just feel a lot better and function better as a society when we're serving ourselves in the world around us. And there's a lot of that missing, right? So when you get into, you mentioned plants, but just generally even reading about it and having conversations about, why is it important to, protect green spaces? Why is it important to preserve migratory patterns for birds? I think it's getting into, you kind of draw focus away from just yourself and into, the wider world around you, the natural living world, which, as human beings, as the most civilized, advanced technology that has ever existed on Earth. I mean, it's an argument that there's more civilized, there's more high-end civilizations elsewhere, somewhere in the universe, but we don't know them. So as far as we know, it's us here on, this is our little planet, this is Earth, this is what we got, and we have a duty towards first of all, noticing it and appreciating it, and then doing something about it, right? Yeah. And you mentioned, having conversations. I think, like 100%, that, having conversations really drives things forward. And also I think if you have enough conversations, then decision makers got to notice, right? At some point, they have to listen to what the people are saying.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, it's the people that make the society. So if we're talking about it more and more, then there will be that change.
Yeah. Well, Matt, Sean, it's been awesome having you on. Thanks so much for coming on, man.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Nice to talk to you.
And let's do this again sometime, man.
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
Great.
Take it easy, man.
Nice
Have
one.
a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, thanks.
Cheers.